In 1782, a group of settlers from Massachusetts headed north to the wilds of Vermont, intending to establish a new community away from the overpopulated coastal areas. The War of Independence had recently ended, and lands previously contested by New York and New Hampshire were open for settlement. The area around Bennington seemed ideal. Fertile valleys, abundant forests, clear streams flowing down from the Green Mountains. The group consisted of 37 people, men, women, and children, seeking a new life on the frontier of civilization. By the spring of the following year, they had all disappeared. There were no bodies, no graves, and no clear explanations. Only burned houses, scattered belongings, and a diary found many years later under the floorboards of an abandoned building. The entries in it ended mid-sentence, and the last pages were smeared with something dark. Blood or dirt, it was impossible to tell. The settlement was named Glastenbury after the town of the same name in England, where the expedition leader Joshua Winthrop came from. He was an educated man, studied at Harvard, and served as a secretary in the colonial administration before the war. After the Declaration of Independence, he decided to leave city life and become a farmer. He convinced 24 families to follow him north, promising them land, freedom, and prosperity. They chose a plot in a valley between two mountain ranges, 10 miles west of Bennington. The place was difficult to reach but sheltered from the winds, with good soil and proximity to a river. In the spring of 1782, they arrived at the site. They cleared a path, built the first log cabins, and plowed the fields for planting. The work was hard. The forest was dense. Stones littered the soil, and the roots of old trees had to be uprooted by hand. But enthusiasm was high. People believed in the success of the venture. By July, there were 12 houses, a barn, and a communal well. They planted corn, beans, and pumpkins. The livestock, 6 cows, a dozen pigs, and 24 chickens, were placed in pens. The first strange events began in August. One of the settlers, Samuel Gray, a middle-aged farmer with a wife and 3 children, reported that 2 pigs were missing. The pen was intact, the gate was closed, but the animals were gone. The tracks led into the forest but quickly disappeared on the rocky ground. Gray suspected wolves, although the tracks did not resemble those of wolves. They were too large, with deep claw marks. Winthrop organized a hunting party. 8 men with muskets combed the area for 2 days but found nothing. No pigs, no wolves, no bears. A week later, a cow disappeared. This time from the yard of Thomas Marsh, a blacksmith by trade. The animal had been tied up by the barn, but in the morning the rope was broken and the cow was gone. The ground around it was torn up, as if in a struggle. There were not many bloodstains, but enough to understand that the attack had been brutal. The trail led north to the slopes of Glastenbury Mountain, which towered above the settlement. The next hunting party was larger, 12 men, including Winthrop. They followed the trail. They climbed the slope for most of the day. The forest grew denser, the old trees closing their crowns, creating semi-darkness even at noon. The trail was lost on rocky outcrops, then reappeared. They found the remains of a cow at an altitude of about 1,000 feet, or rather what was left of it. The bones were gnawed clean and scattered over a wide area. The ribs were broken, the skull split open. The flesh had been stripped away almost completely, but not eaten. Most of it lay around, rotting, covered with flies. It was as if the killing had been done not for food, but for the sake of the process itself. Mars examined the remains in silence. He had seen the results of attacks by predators, bears, lynxes, wolf packs. This was different, too methodical, too destructive. He picked up a fragment of rib and showed it to Winthrop. The bone had not been bitten through by teeth. It had been broken, crushed by enormous force. Winthrop nodded without saying anything. He ordered them to descend. It was getting dark, and no one wanted to stay in the mountains at night. They returned to the settlement after dark. They told everyone about their discovery. The reaction was predictable. Fear, demands for action, suggestions to leave the place. Winthrop calmed the people down. He said it was probably a bear, a large and aggressive one. He suggested strengthening the protection of livestock, keeping animals closer to homes and not letting them into the forest. He assigned night watches. 2 men with guns patrolled the perimeter of the settlement from sunset to sunrise. A month passed quietly. There were no attacks. The crops ripened, and the weather was good. People began to relax and return to their normal lives. Night watches were reduced to 1 person, then canceled altogether. It seemed that the threat had passed. At the end of September, a child disappeared. Mary Clarkson, a 7-year-old girl, daughter of carpenter Henry Clarkson. She was playing outside in the evening, and her mother went inside for a minute to check on dinner. When she came out, the girl was gone. She screamed and called her husband. They began searching immediately. They called her name, searched the houses, barns, and the well. Nothing. The search continued throughout the night. Torches lit up the forest around the settlement. Men combed through the bushes, checked every ravine, every crevice. At dawn, they found a trail. Small barefoot prints leading to the edge of the forest. There they mixed with others, large, strange shapes. Not human, not bear. Something in between, but irregular. The toes were too long, the claws too deep. The tracks led uphill, the same Glastenbury Mountain where they had found the cow. 20 men went there, armed with everything they had: muskets, axes, knives, pitchforks. The women and children stayed in the settlement, locked themselves in the largest house, and barricaded the doors. The search lasted 3 days. They combed the slopes, gorges, and caves. They found scraps of fabric from Mary's dress caught on branches. They found her shoe stuck between rocks. They found the place where the struggle had taken place. Broken branches, dug up earth, bloodstains on the foliage. But they did not find the girl. On the 3rd day, as the sun was setting, they heard a sound. Not a scream, not a roar. Something in between. A long, modulating howl coming from somewhere above, from the top of the mountain. The sound was loud, echoing between the rocks, distorting its direction. It lasted about 10 seconds, then stopped. The people stood motionless, peering into the twilight between the trees. No one suggested following the sound. Winthrop ordered them to descend. They returned to the settlement at night, exhausted and frightened. Henry Clarkson did not return with them. He stayed in the forest, continuing to search. He shouted his daughter's name into the darkness until his voice was hoarse. 2 men went after him the next morning. They found him by a stream, sitting on a rock, staring into the water. His eyes were empty, his lips moving silently. They took him by the arms and let him down. He did not resist, walking like a sleepwalker. His wife met them at the doorstep. Her husband looked through her, not recognizing her. She cried and took him inside. He sat in the corner for 3 days, not saying a word, not reacting to anything. On the 4th day, he hanged himself from a beam in the barn. His wife found him in the morning. She screamed and fainted. The neighbors picked her up and carried her into the house. They took down the body and buried it next to a small cemetery where 2 settlers who had died of fever in the summer already lay. There was no priest. The nearest one was in Bennington, 10 miles away. Winthrop read the prayer himself, from memory. His voice trembled. After the funeral, a council was convened. All the adult men and women gathered in the common house. They discussed what to do next. Opinions were divided. Half insisted on leaving. The place was cursed. It was dangerous to stay. The other half objected. Too much work had been put in. Winter was approaching, and there was nowhere to return to. Winthrop tried to calm everyone down and offered a compromise. They would strengthen the fortifications, build a stockade around the settlement, and maintain a permanent armed guard. They would wait until spring and then decide. The vote was almost even. The majority agreed to stay with a margin of 2 votes. 8 families said they would leave regardless of the decision. Winthrop did not stand in their way. They gathered their belongings, took their horses, and left for Bennington the next morning. 29 people remained. Construction of the stockade began immediately. They cut down young trees, cleared them of branches, and sharpened the ends. They dug them into the ground around the perimeter of the settlement, close together, forming an 8-foot-high wall. The work progressed quickly. Fear was a better motivator than any overseer. Within a week, the stockade was ready. It wasn't perfect. There were gaps, but it was enough to stop an animal, or a person, or whatever else might come. The gate was made massive, with a crossbar on the inside. A permanent guard was posted, 4 men changing every 6 hours. The guns were kept loaded, the powder dry. No one went outside the palisade after sunset. Even the cattle were herded inside for the night. October was cold. The first frosts came early. The leaves fell quickly. The forest became bare, revealing the slopes of the mountains, black against the gray sky. The days grew shorter. Darkness came earlier and lasted longer. The nights were restless. People woke up to sounds, rustling behind the walls, scratching on the logs of the houses, quiet knocks whose source could not be determined. The guards reported movement in the forest, shadows between the trees, visible out of the corner of the eye, disappearing when looked at directly, breaking branches, footsteps on the dry leaves surrounding the settlement, but never coming close enough to see the source. One guard, William Turner, a young man of about 20, swore he saw a figure standing at the edge of the forest. Tall, stooped, with long limbs. He shouted and raised his rifle. The figure did not move. He fired a warning shot into the air. The figure disappeared. It didn't run away. It just ceased to be visible, as if it had dissolved. Winthrop listened to the story in the morning. He didn't comment. He wrote it down in the diary he had been keeping since the settlement was founded. The entries grew darker with each passing week. The optimism of the first few months gave way to anxiety, then outright fear. He tried to hide it from the others, but his loved ones could see it. His wife, Rebecca, said he hardly slept, sitting by the window at night, staring into the darkness. In mid-October, another person disappeared. John Preston, a hunter and one of the best marksmen in the settlement, went out early in the morning to check the traps by the stream and did not return by noon. A group of 6 people went out to look for him. They found his rifle by the stream, leaning against a tree. The powder in the powder flask was wet. The gun hadn't been fired. They found his hat caught on a bush 50 yards from the stream. They found signs of a struggle, deep furrows in the ground, as if he had been dragged. The trail led uphill. They followed it for a short distance. After 100 yards, the trail ended at a rocky outcrop. Beyond that, there were only rocks that did not retain footprints. They searched for several hours, spreading out in a fan shape, checking every direction. Nothing. Preston had disappeared just like the girl Mary. No body, no clear circumstances. They returned to the settlement gloomy. Winthrop recorded the incident in his diary. He added a thought. What if it wasn't an animal? What if it was a person living in the forest, attacking the settlers? Indians? A deserter? A madman? But the tracks were not human, and the strength required to drag away a grown man was beyond human. That same night, the attack began. Around midnight, the guards heard noises at the stockade, scratching, scraping, as if something was trying to squeeze through the logs. They raised the alarm. The men rushed out of their houses with weapons while the women and children took shelter inside. Torches were lit, illuminating the perimeter. Nothing could be seen. The sounds continued, moving along the wall. The guards fired into the darkness beyond the palisade at random. Musket explosions, flashes of fire, smoke. The sounds stopped. The silence lasted a minute or two. Then they resumed on the other side of the settlement. The men ran there. They fired again. Silence again, then sounds from the third side. The game lasted 2 hours. Something or someone surrounded the settlement, checked the fortifications, forced the defenders to run around the perimeter, wasting gunpowder and energy. Finally, around 2 in the morning, the sounds stopped completely. They greeted dawn exhausted and on edge. In the morning, they inspected the stockade from the outside. They found scratches on the logs, deep, long, left by something sharp. The height of the scratches varied from 3 to 7 feet above the ground. Whatever was out there could reach high. They found a print in the soft earth at the base of the stockade. Winthrop measured it, 16 inches long, 8 inches wide. The shape was distorted, but 5 toes were discernible, each with a claw. Not a bear's paw, not a human footprint. Something in between, but irregular. He sketched the print in his journal. He added a note. "I don't know what it is. I'm afraid to find out." The next night passed quietly. And the next. A week without incident. People began to hope that the threat had receded. They reinforced the palisade, adding a second row of logs in weak spots. They stocked up on firewood for the winter, salted meat, and prepared vegetables. They prepared to survive the cold. At the end of October, a blizzard began. Early, strong, unusual for this time of year. Snow fell for 3 days without interruption. It covered the ground with a layer 2 feet thick. The settlement was plunged into white isolation. Visibility dropped to a few yards. The wind howled, tearing off roofs and filling cracks in the walls. On the second day of the blizzard, someone began knocking on the gate. Loudly, insistently, rhythmically. The guards ran up and asked who was there. There was no answer. The knocking continued. They shouted again, louder. Silence. Then the knocking resumed, now in a different place. On the logs of the stockade, to the right of the gate. Then on the left. Then at the rear of the settlement. Winthrop ordered not to open the gate. The men took up positions along the wall, peering into the snowy curtain. The knocking continued, moving around, surrounding them. Sometimes quiet, almost insinuating. Sometimes loud, threatening, as if someone were hitting the logs with a sledgehammer. The blizzard ended on the 4th day. The sun came out, pale and cold. The snow sparkled dazzlingly. They inspected the palisade from the outside. There were no traces. Fresh snow covered everything. But the logs themselves had dents and cracks, as if they had indeed been struck with great force. Several logs were cracked, held only by the ones next to them. They repaired it all day. They replaced the damaged sections and reinforced the weak spots. They worked quickly, in silence. Fear gripped them more than the cold. November brought new disappearances. First, Margaret Ellis, a middle-aged widow. She left her house in the morning to fetch water from the well, which was located in the center of the settlement, 20 steps from her doorstep. A neighbor saw her leave, bucket in hand. A minute later, the neighbor looked out again. Margaret was gone. The bucket lay upside down by the well. The stockade gates were closed, and the guards swore that no one had left or entered. They searched every house, every corner of the settlement. They didn't find her. Margaret disappeared in broad daylight, within the fortifications, in front of dozens of people. Inexplicable. Impossible. Panic ensued. People shouted, demanded explanations, accused each other. Winthrop tried to calm them down, but he himself was at a loss. How was it possible? The stockade was intact. The gate was closed. She couldn't have left unnoticed. She couldn't have vanished into thin air. That same evening, 2 children disappeared. Brothers Samuel and Nathan Dow, aged 8 and 10. They were playing in the barn, hiding in the hay. Their mother called them for dinner, waited, and when they didn't come, went to look for them. The barn was empty. The hay was rummaged through, as if someone had been digging in it. On the dirt floor were the same tracks they had found before. Large, clawed, irregularly shaped. The settlement was in an uproar. The men grabbed their weapons and rushed to check every house and every building. The women gathered the children in one place and surrounded them with a living ring. They searched until late into the night. They found nothing. Winthrop sat in his house, bent over his diary. The pen trembled in his hands. He wrote down the sequence of events, trying to find a pattern, a logic. But there was no logic. The disappearances were random in time and place. The victims were of different ages and genders. The only thing they had in common was that they all vanished without a trace, without witnesses, without a chance of rescue. His wife entered the room and sat down next to him. She put her hand on his shoulder. She asked what to do. He did not answer right away. He looked at the pages covered with his neat handwriting. Notes that perhaps no one would ever read. Evidence of a disaster unfolding in real time. Finally, he said, "We have to leave. Immediately. Don't wait for spring. Don't hope for improvement. Gather everything you can carry and go to Bennington. Now, while we're still alive." Rebecca nodded. They woke up their neighbors and told them the decision. By midnight, the whole settlement knew. By dawn, most had agreed. Only 3 remained. Old Daniel Cole, who did not want to abandon the farm he had spent his last strength on, and the Millers, who believed that fleeing was a sign of weak faith. Winthrop tried to persuade them, but they were adamant. On the morning of November 26th, a group of 26 people left the settlement of Glastenbury. They took what they could: clothes, food, tools. They left their homes, livestock, and crops behind. They opened the gates and left without looking back. The snow was deep, and the going was hard. But fear drove them forward. They walked all day. They stopped for the night in the forest, built fires, and posted guards. The night was restless but uneventful. In the morning, they continued on. By noon, they reached the first farms on the outskirts of Bennington. Civilization, safety. They were greeted with suspicion, frozen, exhausted, their eyes full of terror. They told their story. Most of the listeners were skeptical. Indian raids, perhaps, or wolves, or just panic caused by isolation and the hardships of frontier life. A few people showed sympathy and provided shelter and food. The rest advised them to forget Glastenbury and start over. Winthrop tried to convince the authorities to send an expedition to check on the settlement and find the missing people. The Bennington sheriff listened and promised to consider it. But winter was in full swing, the snow was deep, and the road was dangerous. "In the spring," he said. "In the spring, we'll send people to see what's there." Spring came late. The snow melted in May. When the roads finally opened, the sheriff assembled a group of 10 volunteers. Winthrop joined them, despite his wife's objections. He had to see. He had to know what had happened to those who had stayed behind. They reached the settlement in a day. They rode up to the stockade on horseback. The gate was wide open, creaking in the wind. Vegetation was beginning to push through the snow, entwining the logs. Inside, there was silence. The houses were intact but empty. Many doors were open, some torn off their hinges. Inside, there was chaos. Furniture was overturned, belongings scattered, as if the inhabitants had left their homes in a hurry, or had been dragged out by force. No traces of people were found, no bodies, bones, or graves. The livestock had also disappeared. Cows, pigs, chickens. The barns were empty, the food supplies untouched but covered with mold. It was as if time had stopped at the moment of the disaster. They found the house of old Daniel Cole. He was sitting in an armchair by the extinguished fireplace. He had been dead for several months, judging by the condition of his body. His face was contorted in a grimace of horror, his eyes wide open, staring into the corner of the room. His hands were clenched around the armrests of the chair, his fingers leaving deep scratches in the wood. Death was caused by cardiac arrest, according to the local doctor who examined the body. From fear. The Miller's house was empty. There were signs of a struggle. An overturned table, broken dishes, bloodstains on the floor. Not much, but enough. No bodies were found. The door had been broken down from the inside, The logs of the wall split as if something huge had broken through. They searched the entire perimeter of the settlement. There were new scratches on the palisade, deeper than the old ones. Several logs had been torn out and were lying inside. Traces were visible in the snow, which had not yet completely melted. The same ones. Large, clawed, irregular. Hundreds of tracks surrounded the settlement, leading inside, leading outside, into the forest, up the mountain. One of the volunteers, a hunter named Ethan Cross, followed the tracks. He climbed the Glastenbury slope for several hundred feet. He returned pale, refusing to say what he had seen. He just shook his head and said he would not go any further. Winthrop did not insist. The expedition left the settlement before nightfall. No one wanted to stay there overnight. They returned to Bennington and reported to the sheriff. The official report was terse. The settlement was abandoned. One person was found dead of natural causes, and 2 were missing. The recommendation was not to encourage new attempts to settle the area. The lands around Glastenbury remained empty. Several attempts to establish new settlements were made in the following decades, but all ended in failure. People left, citing poor soil, harsh climate, and inaccessibility. But they whispered about other things, about sounds in the night, about tracks found in the morning, about livestock disappearing without a trace, about a feeling of being watched, constant and heavy, coming from the mountain slopes. Winthrop returned to his normal life. He found a job as a clerk in Bennington and settled with his wife in a small house on the outskirts of town. He never tried to start a farm again. He hid his diary under the floorboards in his house. He didn't destroy it, but he didn't show it to anyone. At night, he would wake up in a cold sweat, dreaming of the forest, the mountain, and the tracks in the snow. He died of pneumonia in 1809. The diary was discovered many years later when the house was being demolished for new construction. The entries were transcribed, and a copy ended up in the Vermont Historical Archives. The original disappeared. Perhaps it was lost. Perhaps it was destroyed by someone who considered its contents too disturbing. The copy survived, but was classified as folklore and unverified evidence. Historians mentioned it in passing, as a curiosity, an example of the paranoia of frontier settlers. But there were other documents. Reports from the Bennington sheriff mentioning strange occurrences in the Glastenbury Mountain area. Letters from settlers in neighboring areas describing sounds in the forest, footprints, unexplained disappearances of livestock. Records from missionaries who worked with the region's Native American tribes. The tribes knew about the mountain. They called it by different names. The place that walks, Mountain of Hungry Spirits, Four-Faced. They told legends about a creature that had lived there since time immemorial. The descriptions varied, but the essence remained the same. Something large, bipedal, covered with dark fur or scales, possessing incredible strength and speed, feeding on flesh, animals, humans, indiscriminately. The Indians avoided the mountains. They did not hunt there, did not set up camps, did not walk the trails. There was a ban that was passed down from generation to generation. Those who violated it did not return. Or they returned changed, silent, frightened, refusing to talk about what they had seen. White settlers ignored the warnings. They considered them to be the superstitions of primitive peoples. They cultivated the land, cut down forests, and built farms. And they paid the price. Glastenbury was the first documented case, but not the last. In 1845, the Thompson family disappeared. Father, mother, 3 children. They lived on a farm 5 miles from the former settlement. Neighbors found the house empty, the livestock scattered, traces of a struggle. The family was not found. The investigation led nowhere. In 1872, lumberjack John Hubert disappeared. He worked with a crew harvesting timber on the slopes of Glastenbury. He went into the bushes and did not return. The crew searched for 3 days. They found his axe stuck in a tree by its handle. It was broken, as if it had been used not for cutting wood, but for defending against something. The woodcutter himself was not found. The 19th century brought industrialization. Quarries were opened in the Glastenbury area, and a narrow-gauge railway was built to transport stone. A small town sprang up, barracks for workers, an office, a shop. The population was about 200 people. It existed for 30 years. Incidents were regular. Workers disappeared, not often, once every few months, but consistently. Officially, they were written off as accidents, desertion, drunkenness. But the workers knew. They whispered about the walker. That's what they called the creature. They said it came out at night, wandered between the barracks, peered into windows. It chose its victim and took them into the forest. It left no traces. There were no witnesses. In 1912, the quarries closed. The stone had been mined out, and extraction became unprofitable. The town emptied within a month. The buildings remained standing, slowly decaying. The railroad was dismantled, and the rails were sold for scrap metal. Nature began to reclaim its own. The 20th century brought a new surge of interest in Glastenbury. In the 1940s, a series of disappearances attracted the attention of the press. 5 people disappeared in the mountain area between 1945 and 1950. They were of different ages, genders, and circumstances. What they had in common was that they all disappeared in the area of the old town or on the trails leading up the hill. The first was Mitty Rivers, 74 years old. She was riding a bus that passed by Glastenbury. The bus stopped for a short break. Mitty got out to stretch her legs and walked away from the road. She never returned. The search lasted a week and involved hundreds of volunteers. Nothing was found. No body, no traces, no clothing. Then Paul Jepson, an 8-year-old boy, disappeared. He was playing near his parents' farm when his mother looked away for a moment. When she looked back, the boy was gone. A large-scale search was conducted, involving dogs and helicopters. Nothing was found. A college student, a hunter, an experienced hiker, all disappeared in subsequent years. Each case received widespread coverage. The press dubbed the area the Vermont Triangle, by analogy with the Bermuda Triangle. Theories multiplied, from alien abductions to serial killers. The truth, as always, remained elusive. The authorities increased patrols. They put up warning signs on the trails. They advised tourists to avoid the area, but they couldn't completely close off access. The land was public, part of a national forest. The disappearances continued, albeit less frequently. Modern researchers are trying to find explanations. Geologists point to the peculiarities of the terrain. Numerous caves, crevices, underground rivers. It's easy to fall through and disappear without a trace. Psychologists talk about disorientation and panic leading to fatal mistakes. Skeptics attribute everything to coincidences and statistical anomalies. But there are details that do not fit into rational explanations. Traces found periodically, the very ones described by Winthrop 200 years ago. Large, clawed, irregularly shaped. Photographs exist, analysis has been conducted. The results are ambiguous. Not a bear, not a human, not a known animal. Either a fake or something unknown to science. Sounds recorded on audio by tourists and researchers. A howl unlike that of a wolf or a coyote. Lower, more drawn out, with a metallic overtone. Bioacousticians analyzed it but were unable to identify it. Either an unknown species, an atmospheric phenomenon, or a fake. Eyewitness accounts accumulated over decades. Hundreds of reports of sightings of something large, bipedal, moving in the forest. Descriptions vary in detail but agree on the main points. About 8 to 9 feet tall. Massive build. Covered in dark hair. Moves quickly, almost silently. Avoids direct contact, but sometimes follows people, watching from a distance. Cryptozoologists classify it as a possible specimen of an unknown primate. A relict population, possibly related to Gigantopithecus or another extinct species. The problem is the lack of physical evidence. Not a single body, not a single skeleton, not a single reliable sample of tissue or hair. An alternative explanation is paranormal. The creature is not from the physical world, but from another, a spirit, a demon, an interdimensional entity. It appears periodically, hunts, and disappears. This explains the lack of remains and the inability to catch or kill it. But it requires acceptance of a reality that science does not recognize. The third explanation is sociological. The Bennington Triangle is a modern myth based on real but unrelated events. The human brain looks for patterns and creates narratives. Several disappearances, separated by years, are combined into a single story. Native American legends, colonial records, and modern observations are added. The result is a convincing picture that does not, however, reflect reality. Each explanation has its supporters. Each explains some of the facts while ignoring others. The truth is probably somewhere in between, or perhaps beyond our understanding. Glastenbury Tor stands tall. Covered in forest, fog often envelops its summit. The trails are rarely used. Tourists prefer more popular routes. Locals avoid it. They know the stories, believe them or not, but remain cautious. Why take the risk? Sometimes someone goes there. An adventurer, a skeptic, someone who wants to test the legends, or just a lost tourist. Most return without incident. They see a beautiful forest, wild nature, nothing unusual. They say that the fears are exaggerated, the myths unfounded. Some return changed. Silent, refusing to discuss their experience. They answer direct questions evasively, change the subject. They saw something, experienced something, but are not ready to talk about it. Or they cannot. Words cannot adequately convey the experience. A few do not return. The statistics are inaccurate. Not all disappearances are recorded as related to Glastenbury. A person simply disappears, a search is conducted, but to no avail. The case is closed as an accident. Another name is added to the list, a long list that stretches back centuries. Winthrop's diary is kept in the archives of the University of Vermont. It is available to researchers upon request. The pages have yellowed, the ink has faded, but the text is legible. The last entry is dated November 25, 1782, the day before he fled the settlement. The entry is short and disjointed. Winthrop wrote in a hurry, his handwriting uneven. He described the sounds that night. Scratching, scraping, something walking around his house. He described a glimpse out the window. Eyes, yellow, glowing in the dark, too high above the ground. A figure outside the window, vague but discernible. Tall, stooped, with long arms. The entry breaks off mid-sentence. It's looking at me. It knows I'm writing. Then nothing. The next page is blank. The rest of the diary is empty. What stopped Winthrop? Fear? An interruption? The realization that his notes were pointless, or something else? The questions remain. There are no answers. Glastenbury keeps its secrets, perhaps forever. Perhaps until someone finds definitive proof, or becomes it. The forest is growing. Trees cover the places where the settlement's houses once stood. The stockade rotted away a century ago. The logs turned to dust and became overgrown with moss. Nature has erased all traces of human presence. Only those in the know can find the remains. Foundations, overgrown cellar pits, rusty fragments of tools. Archaeologists visited the site several times. They conducted excavations and collected artifacts. They found little. The settlement did not exist for long and left few traces. But they did find one oddity. Bones buried deep outside the cemetery. Many bones, hundreds of fragments mixed together, of different types. Human, cow, pig, deer, broken, gnawed, piled up in disorder. Analysis showed their age, late 18th century. This coincides with the period of the settlement's existence. But there is no explanation. Why put the bones in a pit? Who did it? The settlers? Or something else? Archaeologists published a report noting the unusual nature of the find. They suggested a ritual, a waste disposal practice, or the consequences of disease. But the tone was cautious, uncertain. The find did not fit into standard explanations. One of the archaeologists, Jennifer Stone, later gave an interview. She spoke of strange feelings at the excavation site. A feeling of being watched, constant and heavy. The team worked quickly, trying to finish before dark and leave before nightfall. No one wanted to stay there in the dark. They didn't discuss why, but everyone felt it. She mentioned a find that was not included in the official report. A trace in the mud at the edge of the excavation. Fresh, left recently. Large, clawed, irregular. She took a photo and showed it to her colleagues. They discussed it and decided not to include it in the report. Too controversial? Too open to misinterpretation. The photo exists, stored in Stone's personal archive. She rarely shows it, and reluctantly. The mountain lives its own life. The seasons change. Snow covers the slopes in winter, melts in spring. Leaves turn yellow in autumn, fall, decay. The cycle continues, regardless of people, their fears, their stories. But sometimes, at certain times, in certain light, it seems that the mountain is watching, not physically. There are no eyes on the rocks, no face in the contours of the summit. But the feeling is there. A presence, a consciousness, something ancient, patient, observing. Those who sense this leave quickly. They don't run. Running provokes predators, but they walk decisively without looking back. They return to civilization, to roads, to people. They may or may not talk about their experience, but they remember. They always remember. The Bennington Monster, that's what they call it. The name is arbitrary, having stuck over the decades. The entity remains nameless, undefined. Animal, spirit, something else? The definition depends on one's beliefs, worldview, and willingness to accept reality beyond the ordinary. Science requires evidence, physical, measurable, reproducible. Without it, the phenomenon does not exist, remaining an anecdote, a legend, a misperception. Proponents of the scientific approach are right in their method. But the method has its limits. What if the phenomenon eludes documentation? What if it exists precisely on the edge, in the twilight zone between the real and the imaginary? A philosophical question, of no practical significance. People continue to disappear. Statistics are kept, investigations are conducted, explanations are sought. The circle closes, the pattern repeats. The Glastenbury settlement was the first to be documented, but not the first in absolute terms. Native American legends go back centuries. Tribes came, built camps, disappeared. The legends remained, passed on to survivors, flowed into new generations. White settlers repeated the mistake. They did not listen to warnings, did not respect boundaries. They paid the price. Some learned their lesson and left. Others remained, stubborn or foolish. They became part of history, missing names in the archives. The cycle will continue. There will be new disappearances, new investigations, new theories. Maybe someday the truth will be revealed. Maybe not. Maybe there is no truth, only an endless approximation that never reaches its goal.